Okay, let's jump right in. Welcome, everyone, to this deep dive. We're looking at some really interesting source material you shared, specifically that article on calming brain inflammation in Alzheimer's.
It's definitely a hot topic
Hmm.
because, it signals a potential shift, a pretty big one, in how we're thinking about treating Alzheimer's.
Right. For so long, it felt like all the attention was on amyloid plaques and uh, tau tangles, those protein clumps.
Absolutely. And they're important, no doubt, but the clinical trials targeting just those haven't really delivered the knockout punch everyone was hoping for.
Yeah, it feels like maybe that wasn't the whole story, or maybe just a later part of it. And these sources you pointed us to, they suggest looking somewhere else entirely.
Mm-hmm. Towards the brain's own immune system. Which sounds counterintuitive at first, maybe.
A little, yeah. And there's the specific pathway mentioned again and again, cGA-STING. Can you unpack that for us?
Sure. That's really the core of it, the cGA-STING pathway. It's basically about understanding how this internal defense system, which should be protecting the brain, might actually start contributing to the damage in Alzheimer's.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. Let's explore how this cGA-STING thing seems to go wrong in Alzheimer's, based on your sources, and what that means for, potential new treatments.
Sounds good. So first, what does it normally do? cGAS-STING is fundamentally an immune sensor. Think of it like a cellular burglar alarm.
Okay, an alarm system. What sets it off?
It's looking for DNA that's in the wrong place, specifically DNA floating around outside the cell's nucleus.
The nucleus being the secure vault for our genetic code.
Exactly. So if DNA shows up elsewhere, in the main part of the cell, the cytoplasm cGAS detects it.
And assumes it's bad news.
Typically, yes. It assumes it's a sign of, say, a viral infection, because viruses often dump their DNA into the cytoplasm. So cGAS activates S-STING, and STING sends out this big warning signal.
Right, mobilizes the defenses. Got it. Okay, so that's the normal job.
Huh.
How does this get messed up in Alzheimer's, according to the research you shared?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. The sources explain that brain cells, especially as they age or get damaged, can sometimes leak
Leak what?
their own DNA. Little fragments can escape from the nucleus into the cytoplasm.
Ah, so it's not necessarily an outside invader, it's the cell's own stuff.
Precisely. But the cGAS-STING system isn't great at telling the difference. It just sees DNA in the wrong place and thinks, threat.
So it rings the alarm anyway,
Yeah,
even though it's friendly fire, essentially.
that seems to be the case. It mistakes this self-DNA for foreign DNA and triggers that whole immune response. A false alarm, basically, prompted by internal cell stress or damage.
Okay, so the alarm's going off when it shouldn't be. What happens next in the brain, based on the material?
Well, that alarm triggers the release of inflammatory chemicals. Sort of like calling in the troops, but when there's no actual enemy.
And the source mentions specific ones, right? Like IL-6 and TNF.
Yes, interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor. These are powerful pro-inflammatory signals.
And normally they help fight infection, but here...
Here, because the alarm keeps ringing due to that misplaced self-DNA, these chemicals are released chronically. And that constant inflammation is damaging.
How so? What does it do?
It can injure nearby brain cells, which might cause them to leak DNA, spreading the problem. It creates this sort of self-sustaining cycle of inflammation.
Like a wildfire.
Exactly. And the sources connect this chronic, low-level but persistent inflammation directly to the kind of brain damage and cognitive decline we see in Alzheimer's.
So the immune system's response itself becomes part of the problem.
A potentially major part. And there was another point in the material that this overactive pathway might also encourage the buildup of those tau tangles we mentioned earlier.
Wow. Okay, so it could be hitting things on multiple fronts, a real double whammy.
It seems possible, yeah?
Now, the source also touched on something else intriguing.
Yeah.
Potential outside triggers. Could something else kickstart this whole thing?
That's a really interesting angle they explore. It brings up studies that have found traces of the herpes simplex virus, HSV-1.
The cold sore virus.
That's the one. Found in the brains of some people who had Alzheimer's.
So does that mean herpes causes Alzheimer's?
Whoa, no, the source is very careful there. It doesn't prove causation at all.
Right.
But lab studies do show that HSV-1 infection can activate the cGAS-STING pathway.
Ah, well.
So the idea, or maybe just a hypothesis at this stage, is that perhaps an old viral infection could, prime the pump. It might make the system more likely to overreact later on, maybe when the brain cells start aging or leaking their own DNA.
So not a direct cause, but maybe a contributing factor. Setting the stage.
Possibly. It's another piece of the puzzle that researchers are looking at. It adds complexity, for sure.
Okay, so we have this normally helpful alarm system, cGAS-STING. It gets confused by the cell's own leaky DNA in Alzheimer's, triggering chronic inflammation that causes damage, and maybe even past infections play some kind of role.
That sums it up pretty well.
Which leads us, naturally, to treatments. If this pathway is a problem, how are scientists thinking about fixing it, based on what you read?
Right. The goal isn't to just switch the whole system off. That would be bad. We need it.
Right, for actual infections.
Exactly. So the idea is more about dialing it down, calming the mistaken activation, and the sources lay out a few different strategies.
Such as?
Well, there's gene editing, using tools like CRISPR to maybe turn down the gene that makes the STING protein, so there's just less of it around to react.
Okay, genetic tuning. What else?
Developing drugs. Small molecule drugs that could physically block the STING protein from sending its signal, or maybe blocks cGAS from detecting the DNA in the first place.
Like putting a muffler on the alarm?
Something like that, yeah. And then there's repurposing existing drugs.
Drugs already used for other things.
Mm-hmm. The source mentions looking at anti-inflammatory drugs, maybe like the ones used for rheumatoid arthritis or other autoimmune conditions.
How would they help here?
The thinking is they could block some of those damaging chemicals like IL-6 that get released after STING sounds the alarm. So you're not blocking the initial alarm, but you're mopping up the downstream mess it causes.
Okay, so different angles. Tuning the gene, blocking the protein, cleaning up the inflammatory fallout.
And maybe even combining approaches. Perhaps hitting a STING and using something to help clear out the tau proteins, for instance. Tackling it from multiple sides.
It really does sound like a new direction.
Yeah.
So where does this research stand now? Are these treatments close?
Close is relative in medical research, isn't it? It's definitely still early days for Alzheimer's specifically. But there is some existing momentum.
How so?
Because drugs targeting STING are already being developed and even tested for things like cancer and some autoimmune diseases.
Oh, right. So maybe some of that work could be adapted or repurposed for Alzheimer's.
That's the hope. It could potentially speed things up. But safety is paramount, especially in the brain. And there's a huge challenge, which your sources highlight.
Which is?
The balancing act. Figuring out when to treat. Early on. Later. And how much do you dampen the system? Turn it down too much, and you risk leaving the brain vulnerable to real infections.
Yeah, that's tricky. You don't want to create a new problem while trying to solve the old one.
Exactly. It requires a very precise touch. But the animal studies mentioned are encouraging.
What did they find?
Mice that were engineered to show Alzheimer's-like symptoms, like memory problems. Well, when researchers blocked the cGAS-STING pathway in these mice, their symptoms actually improved.
That is promising. It suggests the pathway really is involved in the disease process, not just a bystander.
It's a strong piece of evidence, yeah. But, as always,
human trials are needed.
Absolutely. That's the crucial next step to see if this translates to people.
Okay. So, wrapping up this deep dive, looking back at the sources you shared, the big takeaway seems to be that this cGAS-STING pathway is, well, a really significant new avenue for Alzheimer's research and potential treatment.
It really is. It's a shift away from just focusing on the protein clumps, the plaques and tangles, towards looking at this underlying inflammatory process driven by the brain's own immune system going a bit haywire.
And the potential payoff, as the research suggests, could be huge. Actually slowing down memory loss, improving quality of life, by cooling down that harmful brain inflammation.
That's the ultimate goal, yes. It represents a fundamental rethinking of what might be driving the disease at a cellular level.
It definitely offers a fresh perspective. And thinking about this whole deep dive, it leaves you with a really interesting question to chew on, doesn't it? What does it really mean when our own defenses, our immune systems, mistakenly attack parts of ourselves?
Yeah.
And how incredibly careful do we have to be when we try to step in and adjust that balance without accidentally making things worse in some other way?
It highlights the sheer complexity of our biology. That balance is incredibly delicate.